What I'd like to focus on, first of all, is just emphasizing how much, even though this is a report about Latin America and the challenges that Latin American cities are facing, Homey underscored this is clearly the challenge that the world is facing. Getting this right for cities couldn't have more dire consequences. It's game over if we don't get it right, I think he said in no uncertain terms. And I would agree with that. I would also say that the themes you surfaced here actually will be very familiar. Some of those policy challenges could be ripped straight from the playbook of concerned urbanists in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So I just want to underscore that I think these challenges around the interconnected housing and infrastructure, access to jobs and opportunities, all of those would be just as familiar for those of us here in Chicago or DC as they are in Bogota or Buenos Aires or some of the other cities that you've highlighted there. This report, one of the key conclusions, and you said it was a provocative one, and I'd agree, is that urban policy has been focusing on the wrong end game, that all cities need to be compact and dense, and that that's what we should be planning for. And I think it's really an important flip to say that accessibility can be accomplished through a range of different approaches, and that actually a lot of different development patterns might work if we were paying attention to accessibility and opportunity as the critical driver right away. What you call in the report as this phenomenon of triple informality, so housing, jobs, and transportation, really important to highlight the way that these three things go together, both as sort of the three legs of the stool of a strong, stable foundation of cities. When one of them is out of sync, they have reinforcing effects on each other. Again, highly relevant for places like cities in the United States that are grappling with new ways of measuring accessibility. The Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago trying to put forth a housing and transport index to show how much the costs of affordability are exacerbated when you live farther away from your job. The second thing that I think will be very resonant for US audiences and others just is the problem of creating a policy environment that enables a robust market to produce physical infrastructure. So I'd like to hear more about that and unpack some of that in our discussion today. You talk about a mix of sort of incentive-based policy levers, so congestion pricing, off-day driving, things that actually intervene in the individual consumption decisions of urban residents. But there are also some of these bigger picture planning frameworks, deciding how to think about transportation investment across municipalities that we need to push at the same time. So thinking about what that playbook is and pulling out some of the ideas from the report about, in particular, how to finance these investments is something I'd like to talk about. The implementation challenges you describe will also be incredibly familiar to those of us living in the United States, for sure. In particular, you talk about the effect of sort of short-term market thinking and also short-term political cycles. So this is something that we've struggled against here in this country as well, trying to figure out how to finance infrastructure investments that are going to be much longer term than the political cycle of one mayor, two mayors of any political administration. And then these questions around metropolitan governance coordination, we have not necessarily been able to tackle any more effectively here, and I think we'll be looking for lessons from Latin America and other places that have thought about the right kinds of vehicles to get this done. So I think to turn this over, I'd like to really start to dig into lessons on the ground. So Eduardo, you have a lot of experience in Colombia and in Bogota, and I'd like it if you could share some of your experience bringing this report's recommendations to ground there, and in particular, if you could comment a bit on the methodology and some of the other ways we think about measuring accessibility.
Yep, thank you. Well, first of all, I have to say that this is a great report. I found it very well informed and very well thought all over. On Bogota, I have to say that I learned a lot when I read the report. Actually, I wasn't aware of many of the findings that were highlighted in the report. Obviously, I was very aware of all the congestion problems that Bogota faces, but I wasn't aware that Bogota was the densest city in the whole of Latin America, and one of the few, or probably the only one, whose density increased in the past 15 or 20 years, which is exactly the opposite of what is happening everywhere else. Yeah. So that was very interesting for me, and it was a complete discovery. I had no idea that that was going on. I also discovered, and that was interesting, that Bogota, like other Latin American cities, have very relatively low space ratios per capita. The typical dwelling in a Latin American house, in a Latin American city, is 26 meters, or between 26 and 30 meters per capita. Okay? Bogota is 26, but what is very peculiar about Bogota is that there is no social gradient in that. So rich people live as cramped as poor people. And obviously there is a reason for that, which is congestion and access. Rich people buy access by buying very expensive places close to work, even if they have to sacrifice the space. And that tells you the drama of a city like Bogota. So all those things were very interesting for me to read in the report, because it sort of gave me like new angles to look at the old problems of Bogota. On the issue that you mentioned about how to measure cities, and that was also in a way announced by Juan, I don't know if you could put the graph, the map for Washington. I like very much the way they use the data, and I think that there is a tremendous promise in this big data to analyze urban problems. But I'm not quite sure how it was operationalized, and I don't think that you can get around the problem of commuting times. I think it's very difficult to define a city without taking into account commuting times. And let me tell you why.
Can I just pause just for clarification?
Sure.
So the big data you're talking about in this case, and the novel methodological intervention here, is the use of satellite data on luminosity and light
the
times.
luminosity data, which I want. Okay.
Great, but just we're talking about the nighttime data and the satellite
the nighttime data
Yep.
that one showed, and that is going to appear in the screen in a minute.
Yep.
They basically measure cities as the cluster of a stable, and I'm citing it. Thank you. I'm citing the cluster of the stable light time luminosity pixels, only considering contiguous pixels. Well, if that is so, I don't clearly see how you define what Washington is. Because obviously you see a contiguity of luminosity pixels going northeast along the corridor from DC to Baltimore. And obviously, you continue the map, probably you have to go further north and further north. While at the same time, so you see you are cutting there with no clear reason, while at the same time you are including places that are not so clearly connected to the area, and that are as far as Baltimore would be from DC, such as, for instance, Leesburg. They are equally far away. So I don't think that you can get away with the problem of imposing a threshold of commuting times. When a city is a city, well, they define it. They say a city is, they say that luminosity as a measure of economic activity allows us to clearly identify integrated labor markets, which is consistent with the conceptual definition of city. A city is basically an integrated labor market. That's what it is. Okay, it doesn't matter if the areas are not contiguous to each other. That's irrelevant. I mean, the areas can be separated, but if you can travel easily from one area to the other, that's a labor market, right. and therefore that's a city. And that has to be solved in terms of commuting times.
Right.
There is no way around that. Actually, I have made the calculations for Colombia, and if you consider, let's say, a city as an agglomeration of more than 50,000 people, then you would say that Colombia has 100 cities, roughly. Okay? But if you say, no, let's consider also cities, those that are within a radius of 30 minutes of those municipalities. How many cities do you have? Well, now you don't have 100 cities. Now you have about 70 cities. Okay? But if you say, no, 30 minutes is too short a time. People are prepared to travel an hour and a half, let's say, to go to work. Okay, in that case, you don't have 70 cities. In that case, you have maybe 35 cities. So the point that I want to make is you cannot get around the problem of commuting time. That's essential to the definition of city. If you want to stress it a little bit, you could say cities are relative concepts.
Right.
You cannot define cities in a definite way. Right. So a city is for me where I can really operate.
Yeah.
Maybe a city for you is a different thing.
Right.
And it depends on the activity we're talking about. So that introduces an approach that is probably not so common, but I think it's important.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to something really important here, which is that the experience of the urban resident is critical to the definition of not only what a city is, but of what accessibility is. So I know you've been thinking about this a lot, Pablo. So you've raised in this report this very important conceptual reframe that accessibility is what we have to focus on. Now, how should we be thinking about measuring that? You've raised a host of housing affordability, access to jobs, commuting times, the experience of a resident on the ground, just the sort of friction of life inside that city. Can you share a little bit more, pushing beyond the report, I guess?
Thank you, Alina. Alina?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you very much for Brookings for hosting us. It's quite interesting, quite impressive event. So yeah, this is a kind of difficult question. So we actually operationalize the idea of a city in terms of productivity and welfare related with this conceptual issue of accessibility. So after writing the report, let me tell you what we think about now. What is accessibility? There are two features. One is that the city has to have opportunities. So larger cities will have a large amount of opportunities. And what we call about opportunities, of course, job quality, amenities, services. These are opportunities. So first of all, a city has to have this kind of opportunity. And we say that the larger cities in general have much more open opportunities for people of jobs and all these important things that are important for well-being, including amenities. So, I mean, Eduardo was saying that for us, a city, we economists, is a large labor market. That's okay. But people come to cities also for other things, not only for labor, but for, to enjoy cultural life, to interact with other people, parks, etc. So I totally agree with him, but some other guys would tell me, oh, Pablo, what about park? What about culture? What about... So that's the problem of what we... But anyway, so the first thing is opportunities. The second thing is a large city may have all these things, but you have to be able to reach those things. You have to really be able to enjoy these opportunities. And this will depend on many things. First of all, it will depend on, okay, there is an opera theater, okay, that's nice, but I have to travel, 2 hours. Or it is very expensive, So this idea of being able to enjoy, if I want to, many times I say, I live in Buenos Aires. So I said, I like Buenos Aires because it has so many theaters. It's not because I go every week at the theater. It's just to know that they are there. To me, it increases my well-being. Because if I choose to go, I could go. But in actual terms, I go just two times a year or no more, maybe more, 10. But, the thing is, it has to be there, okay? And I should be free to do it, to choose it or not. So the second thing is you have to have the opportunities, then you have to be able to reach these opportunities, and this includes traffic, includes, infrastructure to get there, time, prices. And also, it should be inclusive in the sense that it should be enjoyable by many, poor people, medium income, and rich people. So that's why another dimension of accessibility. So if I want to measure accessibility, to measure welfare and productivity in cities, I should have all these things into account. And of course, it's a tremendous task in terms of methodology, get data, etc. But we are on that, and of course, Eduardo will help us.
Yeah, great. So building on that, say we all have an agreement about what it's going to take to build a healthy, thriving city for everyone, and that we can agree that accessibility is an essential measure by all the pieces of the measures that kind of roll up into this one macro measure of accessibility. Whose job is it to help set the vision and get this done? And so this is a division of responsibility question that, for those of us here in the United States, we know we need infrastructure investment at the federal level. We still haven't gotten an infrastructure bill. Meanwhile, cities are levying sales tax increases like the County of Los Angeles has done to say we need to do this on our own. talk about the division of labor from a Latin American perspective on this issue, how we can lead, who does what. Let's save the metropolitan governance coordination for another moment, but who are the most essential sort of leading levels of government on this issue?
That's a very important, that's a very interesting question. So let me tell you very briefly what we found it happens in Latin America. So it turns out that the division of labor is quite different depending on the context and depending on the country. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that there's a lot of variation in the type of government that there is in Latin America. So you have federalist governments such as Argentina and Brazil, and you have very unitary or centralist mm-hmm. governments such as Colombia, right? And that matters for who does what in cities, mm-hmm. Because, for instance, in Brazil, the federal government actually, beyond the existence of provinces, the federal government actually creates these metropolitan authorities that you said we shouldn't talk about them, but the federal government creates these metropolitan authorities, yep. And the metropolitan authorities then have a lot of legitimacy because they are sort of imposed by the federal government, and the federal government essentially says, okay, you municipalities have to respond to this metropolitan authority, and it gives the metropolitan authority the capacity to, for instance, raise specific taxes. Mm-hmm. Okay, the same doesn't happen in centralist countries such as Colombia, mm-hmm. right? In Colombia, what happens is that the central government passed a law allowing for municipalities to endogenously or according to their will, create these metropolitan authorities, and this law has been there for about 20 years, and no one has used it except a couple of cities, and the main example is Medellin.
Yes.
So Medellin has a very interesting and well-functioning metropolitan area, responding to exactly the same incentives that are there for any city in Colombia, but no other big city, including Bogota, has done it. So,
can I just pause on that? Is that a capacity issue? What is primarily responsible for Medellin picking this up?
That's a great question. So it has to do with many things, and so for instance, it has to do with the fact that how big are how big are municipalities in the cluster of municipalities that form a metropolitan area? So sometimes smaller municipalities don't want to collude, let's say, with bigger municipalities because they fear that they're going to lose power and authority over the issues, the policy issues that affect their municipality. Sometimes the bigger municipalities don't want to cluster with the smaller municipalities because they think that they're going to end up financing the entire investment, right? So it has to do with size, right, and distribution of power, but it also has to do with political economy things. Mm-hmm. So that has to do with something that you mentioned in your opening remarks, which is what are the incentives of politicians out there to create this type of bodies, right? Because it's going to take time, and whatever benefits these type of bodies are going to bring to the city, these are going to be materialized after I'm out of office. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to get recognition of actually being the one that created.
Right.
So it's. It's a big issue. I don't think so. So maybe my answer is disappointing in the sense that I'm not telling you exactly what should be the division of labor. I'm giving you more a positive sort of answer in terms of describing what's happening in Latin America. Yep. But understanding these experiences allows us to think about the institutional design that you need to come out in different contexts in order to have that, to make that happen.
Flexible. I mean, metropolitan areas are a social and economic construction. Mm-hmm. And many times the institutional building is behind that, okay, with lacks. And so our federal and political institutions, just federal government, provinces, and municipalities. These things come out of nothing, out of economic and social forces that many times it's difficult to comprehend, okay, in terms of political thinking. So that's why it has been so much difficult to do this in many developing countries. And you have to have flexibility because, for example, in Buenos Aires, sorry, such as bias in Argentina. Okay, Buenos Aires, they are thinking about that things, I don't know, 10, 20 years. And now they are thinking about a huge metropolitan government that will do everything. We will do transport, we will do health, we will do, it will do garbage. Maybe you don't want to maybe you need to have more flexibility. Each problem you want to solve, I mean, coordination, like transportation is a difficult nature than garbage. So you need a different sort of agency to do with that.
Right.
So you don't want to create a new mega thing that, is difficult to bureaucratic. So many times politicians do not think like that,
Yeah. Well, it's a perfect answer because you did highlight the heterogeneity of leadership structures, which is one of the defining dynamics of metropolitan governance challenges around the world. So
let me just give a two-finger on that Buenos Aires example.
Yes.
So the Buenos Aires example is also very telling of what I was mentioning about the political economy of making things happen in cities.
Yep.
So in the Buenos Aires case, what happened is that for the past about 40, 50 years, it hasn't been the case that the municipal government and the government of the province and the national government is aligned in terms of being the same party. Well, now it is the case after many decades, right? And so nothing else has changed other than the color of the party of the person in charge, and only that, without any change in law, without any changes in incentives, has helped sort of authorities to align into what does Buenos Aires need in terms of improving quality of life for people and infrastructure, and it's actually working.
Right.
Right? So there's a lot of things to consider.
So on that point, 5 minutes, we're going to open it up for audience questions, but I want to bring it down. So that's a great example of an emerging coordination between multiple levels of government inside one country. Zoom way down for a minute for me and unpack some of the examples this report has of the transactions or financial vehicles or specific policies related to particular developments that have helped to coordinate interest among actors, get some of this long-term investment thinking going to help drive some of those investments. You have a couple of really interesting examples, I think, in the report, also from Buenos Aires, but I'd also love to hear examples from Colombia as well, in Bogota.
Want to go first?
No, I don't really have much to say about that. I learned a lot on the book about that, about the way different financial vehicles can be put together to finance large projects and projects that sometimes cross metropolitan municipality borders. And since obviously that's, financial business is the main reason why they wrote this report, probably should be talking about that.
No, well, one capacity that always local governments used to have, is how to, is regulation of land use.
Yep.
This is mostly in our countries, it's just a local thing, okay? And this is used very, this is used in a, intelligent way. This is very powerful. People think they own property, but they don't. I mean, you don't know. I mean, the government tells you what you can do on the property. So, it's you're not totally owner of the property in that sense. So the idea is that government should use, of course, this power to, of course, as we said in the report, to increase the flexibility. Latin American cities has in part this problem of informality because of this high cost of formal housing, because of the high restriction on land use, especially for housing, in the sense that they are very restrictive. So you have a very, very high minimum lot size. You have restrictions on how up you can go on density. Of course, some of these things are, are there because they are truly, things about you don't want to cause externality. I mean, you want to avoid, of course, congestion of traffic in this neighborhood. You don't want the public service to be congested, water, sanitation. So there are some reason for that. But many times, many times these regulations are not for that, are because they are, interests that were there. People that own this land, they want the value to increase, or they want to, they want not have they want not to be very much building around. But not only that, the second type of restriction is about how the city can grow on the borders. So many planners in our cities, they fear this thing of extension, sprawl, because they don't want the city to grow in a disorganized way without infrastructure. So they put limits on how you can grow on the borders and how you can grow up. So where are the people who go? So this is one of the reasons, and there are a lot of evidence, not for Latin America, but for developed countries, that this is behind the increasing cost of housing. And this, of course, would create that people that have medium income or low income could not go to this, could not access to the formal house, and then you have this the phenomenon of slums, which are, people there are much more packed, and you have part of the problem of high density is because of the density you have in slums. There, they have like 300 people by hectare. So I would say that the idea to use land, to be flexible on land use is very important. And if you do it in a very smart way, you can get money out of that. Because you can, you change the value of you can change the use, the regulation of land, you convert that from, agricultural to urban. Right. Of course, the value increases a lot, the value of the land. Part of that should be get by the government to finance infrastructure on those
right, and the key is to capture it and then reinvest into public purpose. But did you want to respond to that, Eduardo?
Yeah, no, I agree with most of what Pablo has just said, except that I'm not so convinced that the high cost of formal housing in our cities is a result of the difficulty of getting licenses, construction permits, and all that. I'm not convinced of that. And you said there is no evidence for Latin America.
Little evidence.
Yeah, there is very little evidence. That's something that applies very well to the U.S. or to places where the codes are really enforced. The codes in our countries are not enforced. So I don't know why you can claim that those are the causes for the high cost of housing. No, I think that the high cost of formal housing is basically a result of the lack of mobility. Basically the result of lack of mobility, because people want to get close, want to live close to where they work or where there are other amenities. And so the pressure, it gets completely captured by the price of land, not by the price of the construction.
No, you're right.
It's basically the price of land.
No, I'm not saying about the construction.
Why? Because the pressure is caused by the need to be closer. So in a way, it's a byproduct of the other problem that you were discussing. Those problems are not separate. And I think that in the report, you make too much of a separation of the two and saying that, well, the problem of housing, of informal housing is a problem of regulation, while the problem of transportation is no. Those problems are very clearly connected.
Yes, right. So I think it's time to turn it over to our audience for questions, although we've only covered, of course, the first 12th of this report, I'm sure, here. We have roving microphones, I believe. And please await the microphone and identify yourself before you ask your question. And remember that questions end in a question. It's my favorite thing to remind everyone. Okay, right here in the front.
Hi, Martin Rodriguez with the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you for speaking with us today. I want to ask a question related to governance. A problem that I see in not only the federal but also local levels has to do with corruption, obviously, which has detriments to economic development. So can you comment a bit about how corruption, how that can impede trying to implement these policies that you've recommended? Thank you.
We take one more question? Or we
no, I think we'll just go one at a time. We have time to do that. Yep.
Well, this is very related with what Eduardo was saying. I mean, in part, the problem is why local governments have not been using their power to use the land regulation as a tool for financing, etc. Because sometimes they get money, but from their pockets, from some politician pockets. So there was a lot of corruption about how to change the land regulations, and this created a kind of very unsettled and many times. For example, there are many cases of cities that they allowed, say, change regulation in places where there is no infrastructure, or places that are, leapfrogged, so it's not near the border of the city. So this is crazy, you see? And this behind that, there are many issues of corruption that have affected state capacity to do that.
Let me add to that I think that one of the reasons why metropolitan areas don't work when they are led to the discretion of the different municipalities is the potential of corruption.
Right, you're right.
Because of the division.
Because the smaller municipalities, which are usually more corrupt than the larger ones, don't want to get rid of the business that they have working by themselves. They know that if they form part of a larger metropolitan area, they will have to become more transparent, and they will be, in a way, overviewed by bigger bodies. So that's a very important constraint of why metropolitan areas have not worked in Colombia. I don't know other countries, but this is the case of Colombia.
Well, this corruption issue is also tied to the sort of broader umbrella issue of accountability. And I know we've done some research on mayoral powers and how they are changing. And the clear finding that came up over and over again is that regardless of your form of government, having a clear line of sight to between decision-making and the consequences of that decision-making was the most important thing. So I think that ties into this idea that in a fragmented environment, you can have a lot of finger-pointing and nobody's truly accountable.
Let me add, we did a survey to municipalities about what were the most serious problems they face when expanding, the supply of housing in their territories. One of them is that such much regulation and bureaucratic thing, how many times it takes to change regulation by land use. So there's so much regulation that, of course, they do it in formal regulation is so harsh, so restricted, that they do it in an informal way and through this kind of arrangement.
Let's take another question. This sweater, gentleman in the sweater, please.
Irish sweater, if you don't mind my reminding. A long time ago, I first went to Bogota, and I learned the word cachaco, which some of you may know means persons who dress elegantly like Eduardo. I also got to go to Universidad de los Andes and have an office there. That was very lucky for me. From there, I walked down to Carrera Septima, and I looked at the number of people getting in a bus going north along that road. And they were always full. I now live over here in Georgetown and teach at Georgetown University, and the buses are always empty. What a shame. Why can't we be more like Latin America in this country? I think it's a failure in our system not to be responsive. A little later, I learned the word porteño, and I'm sure that Pablo can remind us what that means. Here are my questions, really about policies that have been enacted. One, in Bogota, the transport system is totally different from when I first got there many years ago. And that, I wonder, does that make it work better? Are you getting your money's worth, so to speak? A few places, I think in Mexico City, also have these rules that you can only drive with a odd number license plate on certain days and even the other. Do those pay off? Does that give you positive results? That's the kind of question I'm wondering about.
Perfect. And that, yes, didn't get to cover that.
That's in Bogota or in Mexico?
No. Juan is the person who is an expert.
In Mexico, you want to answer the one now?
Yeah.
And I think one of the clear questions is about the evidence we have for
There's
the impact of these.
Yeah. There is a lot of evidence, a lot of evaluations that have been made in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Quito, they also have the same type of policy.
Santiago too.
And Santiago, and so that policy is about just to summarize it for the audience. That policy is about restricting the use of private vehicles according to the last number of the plate, so they cannot circulate on given days, right? So the intent of that policy is, of course, having less vehicles on the streets and therefore having less traffic. So these evaluations have all pointed to this being very ineffective in terms of reducing both the amount of vehicles in the street and also reducing pollution. And the reason is essentially that in the medium term to long term, people just buy another car, right? Because it's very so you know exactly when you cannot use your car, so you just buy another car. And in countries such as Colombia or Latin American countries, you can actually say, I want to buy a car with, even if the car was new, if it's a used car, obviously, but even if the car was new, you can buy a car and say what plate number you want that car to have, right? And in fact, they usually buy like old cars that are cheaper, and they pollute even more. So pollution actually goes up. Except the exception is Santiago, and the reason that it works in Santiago is because you cannot anticipate when you cannot use your car. It's because there are climate alerts, pollution alerts, right? So according to when pollution reaches a certain level, they just announce in the radio and in the TV, tomorrow you cannot use your car according to a plate number, but you cannot anticipate when that's going to happen, so people just don't buy another car.
Right. Now, the flip of this, of course, is when you don't regulate something in the market, like the increase in rideshare and shared service, how much private car use is up now in cities. This is something we're seeing acutely here in the United States. So you'd mentioned a bit talking about the transportation sort of revolution and its impact in this space. Your empty bus comment made me, this is what triggered this.
Yeah, because that was a topic that I missed in the report. The report didn't mention vehicle sharing systems at all, which I think for me it's an important omission, because that's the future of cities, I think, to a large extent, as we are seeing here in the US. And even in Latin America, I tried to gather some numbers in order to illustrate the point. Now there are 26 cities in 8 Latin American countries that have bike sharing systems. Uber is operating in 15 Latin American countries. And there is a couple of companies, I don't know if you are familiar with those names, Easy Taxi and Tapsi, which operate in 11 countries, which are a sort of Uber, but for taxis. I mean, you have the app, but they operate taxis. However, as you know, there is a lot of resistance, like in many cities in the US, in many cities in Latin America, there are huge resistance about this new system. And another feature that is also interesting to keep in mind is that self-driving car sharing is practically unknown in Latin America.
Right, and
which is very awkward. Right. I mean, the Zipcar, which is the largest company in that business here, has just opened one establishment in Costa Rica past September. Why?
Right.
What's going on? I mean, if you can really solve many of the problems through car sharing, because obviously a car that is shared uses less space in the net.
Sure, right.
So it corresponds to roughly, the calculation is that one shared car corresponds to roughly 15 owned cars.
Right. Much more to know about this.
So that's the future, especially given the fact that still vehicle penetration rates in Latin America are very low.
Yes,
So my question would be, shouldn't you just leapfrog to the future instead of discussing the whole? I mean, what should we do? What should we do to do that?
Certainly going to need smart regulation.
This is a very important point that Guadalupe is making. Actually, we're actually measuring in our surveys how much people use these kind of new things, and it's still, as he was saying, very little. Actually, Uber is 2%. All these new things is still very little, and that's why in the whole report has not such a big deal. But of course, when we talk about policies, they're there. I mean, for example, all the bicycle thing in terms of infrastructure, etc. But the important question about Eduardo is the following: we expect as income increases, there is a kind of demand elasticity. We expect Latin Americans to buy more cars in the future.
No, that's wrong.
But let's see. Let me finish. Let me finish. If we
Trigger the passion point here.
If we take past elasticities, we expect this. Now, as what Eduardo was saying, maybe given these new technologies, the elasticity of income with respect to cars, the future will go down. And of course, this can be induced by policy. You don't let market to do all alone. It can be induced by policy. But this has to be done, okay? If not, between 2007 and 2014, the number of cars in Latin America increased by 40%. 40%. So Eduardo is optimistic in that sense that can be changed. But the only thing I'm saying, okay, it can be done, but you have to work. Cities have to do the work.
Yeah, instead of trying to put obstacles on Uber and all those sharing systems,
no, of course,
you should tax them very lightly and tax own vehicles much higher, and especially because that's going to help you to do other things, like congestion charging.
Yeah, yes.
Congestion charging is much easier if you are driving, if you are sharing cars than if you are that basically you have own cars. So I mean, there are many things that can be discussed. I don't know if these are the solutions. Maybe they are not. But what I am just pointing out is we need to discuss those things. We need to discuss the future.
Yes. Yeah. Next time at Brookings, the impact of rideshare on Latin America transport economy. Right. This is fantastic. I'm glad to have that spirited debate. Gentleman in the tie, we had a right here.
Good morning, Carlos Aramayo from the Fuller Center for Housing Bolivia. I was just in my country 48 hours ago, and my organization has housing projects in Cochabamba and in El Alto, and we're starting one in Santa Cruz. In El Alto, my question is the following. As you guys know, El Alto has been growing exponentially and without any sort of urban planning. And just 48 hours ago, I found out there's Chinese investment coming into the country trying to develop an industrial park. I don't know if your report touches on foreign investment and how that affects social housing, how that affects social policy in terms of urban planning, so on and so forth. Because I can tell you, me as an NGO that builds social housing in a country that, well, politically has dubious ties with other countries, it is an issue that I don't know if development banks have touched on, and I would greatly appreciate it if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Well, this is again related with regulation and land use. Okay, a city has to have opportunities. Within the opportunities, of course, job qualities, and of course, these industrial parks, if they are set in some places in which, of course, they are not, affect housing, the living, residential areas, etc. Of course, you have to accommodate those. But of course, you need to be, this has to add to the city, not to cost to the city. So there are many places, in cities, in many, that these things of the industrial parks has been totally independent of the local government, totally independent. And of course, there is a lot of value there. I mean, the local government could get a lot of taxes from there, but they don't care about that. You see, many times it's a national thing. It's not planned together with the local government because you need land for that. And of course, the local government has something to say. Well, many times I have spoken with local mayors and telling them, well, but you have this industrial park which is, first rate export. Well, we don't care about these guys. I mean, they don't give us any money at all. In part, this is because of sometimes of the formal laws, etc. But sometimes it's just a problem of capacity of the government, local governments, to talk with these guys. Many times they ask for money, in not a very decent way, but you have to do it, formally. So this is a great point, and I don't know what development banks could do about that. Of course, help the governments to this planning capacity, to plan about the local taxes. In this regard, maybe we can help.
I know we have a question in the back. Josh, do you have a mic? Okay.
Hi, my name is Fabiola Jurkesen. I'm a student in urban planning in Georgetown. And I have two comments and I guess a question. When you were discussing about sharing services of cars, I'm from the north part of Mexico, Monterrey. And the biggest thing I experience as a user, and one thing that you did not mention, is security. When you get into an Uber and you can actually track that person back, it's more secure. So for a long time, I didn't take a taxi. Monterey, in particular, has been going through a very difficult time security-wise. It's gotten better, but it was a very rough decade. And so that's one of the things that I didn't hear anyone suggest or consider, the fact that security really affects when we're using apps and we're more interconnected. I also am very interested in seeing if you can elaborate about the credit, about the access to the ability to buy a home. In my experience, I'm 44. My grandparents were the last generation in Mexico that could afford to buy a house with credit. Both of them are deceased, and my grandmother died at 97. So it tells you how long ago that was. So that is something that I think when you think about accessibility and when you think about urban sprawl is really important, because the policy is let's get lower income people out of the cities in these park places that are all the houses are exactly the same. And you can say a lot of things about it, but that really affects the level of traffic, at least in Monterey, that has one of the highest index of pollution in the whole of Latin America, is experiencing. And it is because of the policies of making affordable housing so far away from the center of the city where people work. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just tack onto that. We did not spend a lot of time on the lengthy discussion of housing that you do include in this report, but you do point to rental housing is an important piece of the strategy, but of course also the wealth building and equity portion of being a homeowner is quite important. So please, this is an excellent question and segue to an important topic we haven't touched on much.
So thank you for your comments and questions. I think I totally agree with you that security is definitely one of the reasons why people use these platforms such as Uber. It is also my case. In Bogota, the regular taxis are really unreliable and hostile sometimes. So I cannot be more sympathetic about it. As Pablo said, so what we found out is that people in general in Latin America are not using this platform so much. So far, it's increasingly so. So we don't spend much time in the report talking about this, but I agree with you. In terms of the other thing that you mentioned, we in the chapter about housing, we do discuss, at some extent these policies that are very common nowadays in Latin America about the construction of social housing, right? So as I mentioned, we take very seriously the incidence of slums in Latin America, and one of the probably the most important policy in Latin America to reduce the incidence of informal housing or slums is the construction of urban housing. But in most cases, as you suggested for the case of Monterey, this social housing is in the outskirts of the city with very little connectivity and very little accessibility, to put it in the terms of the report. So what ends up happening, and we have lots of case studies of this for different cities and different countries in the report, what ends up happening is that the take-up of the social housing is very little, right? And even for the households that do take up this housing and end up moving to those houses, you see things, and this is, there's a paper about a housing program in Rosario, Argentina, that showed this. The participation in the labor market for these people goes down, essentially because if you do want to move to the house, then essentially you cannot participate in the labor market anymore because you just cannot reach there. So there are lots of evidence mounting up showing that social housing projects that just move people to the outskirts of the city just do not work.
Mm-hmm. Great. So unfortunately, we are out of time for this discussion today, but the mark of a great report is that it sparks debate and engagement. So I hope you will all download it, read it, continue to engage with the authors and the community that's discussing it. You know, the World Urban Forum is underway in Kuala Lumpur this week, and just another sort of place where I think carrying this message about building cities that are accessible to all is going to be underscored, as well as the conversation around implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in other places. But if there was anything that this discussion made clear is that there is not one person or role or level of government that is charged with building this vision, building this future for cities. It's really all of our jobs. So I would just, with that, Please join me in thanking these panelists. They were terrific. And off we go.